everyone. I know most of the people on the call, but in case you don't know me, I'm Rabbi Fischel, and I am so excited to join together today for a conversation between me and Dr. Abigail Gewirtz on, and I have the book here to prove it, When the World Feels Like a Scary Place, Essential Conversations for Anxious Parents and Worried Kids. We, are about to start Hanukkah just tomorrow night, a holiday in which we bring light and light lights, and often a holiday that feels sort of pediatric, that we sort of gear it towards children. And I think that is right, because children often bring light and bring light exponentially into our lives and into our homes. And then sometimes because of that, we can be surprised when children bring a little bit of darkness, right? When they come in with some topics that we're not prepared for, that are not light and fluffy, that are harder, and that maybe we're not ready to engage with our children about. And that's where Dr. Gewirtz comes in. So she is a professor at the University of Minnesota's College of Education and Human Development. She's worked with the US Congress and UNICEF on parenting, and has conducted research in the US, Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, and has been invited to speak throughout the world on parenting in times of stress, and has most recently written this book, When the World Feels Like a Scary Place. Crazy that it sounds like it, my first question to her when we met was like, did you write this at the beginning of 2020? Like, I don't understand how you got this out so quickly. But an unbelievably timely book, and also really, really beneficial. I know, most of you know that I have just recently become part of the parenting club here, and my 4-month-old is not yet having essential conversations with me. However, the amount that the book has already taught me about figuring out my own emotions in order to have those conversations has been wonderful, and really helpful. I also must mention that we are able to provide this opportunity this evening through the Jewish Book Council, and we are so grateful to them for allowing us to have this conversation. And there is a link in the chat to buy Dr. Gewirz's book, so you should feel free and encouraged to do that. And we're just going to get started. The way this is going to work is it's going to be mainly a conversation between us, but also with all of you, I would hope. So I'll ask some questions in the beginning, but then we'll open it up to everyone here. And we hope that this can just be a dialogue between all of us. Rich Gordon, many of you know him. His title says WHC Rich Gordon. He's our tech person. So actually, Rich, once we open it up to questions, if you could look out for hands and things like that, that would be great. And we'll get started. So thank you all for being with us tonight. So yeah, as I said, it feels like you wrote this for, a world in pandemic, and you do have a chapter about that, but actually the book started way before that. So can you share a little bit about how you got on this journey and why you think it's important for this book to be read and distributed?
For sure. And hi, everyone. And it's really a treat to be with you. And this is definitely one of those book events that I wish I could have done in person. I don't say that to everyone, depending on where you are and how, but it's really, I love DC. It's close to my heart. I told Rabbi Fischel that my daughter lives in DC, DuPont Circle. And there's so many reasons why I love DC. So, Cheryl, thank you for the picture of the cherry blossoms, and hopefully one day we'll be able to do these kinds of things in person again, and hopefully soon. Yeah, I didn't decide to write the book in 2020. If only you could get a book published that quickly and on the shelves. But it was actually after the last election in 2016, when I felt as if the world was becoming a scary place. My kids, 4 of them, were a little older, and the youngest had just become a teen. But with the level of polarization and angry discourse in the 2016 election, which I think probably after 2020 elections, hard to remember, just felt like civil discourse had deteriorated to such a great extent. You'll probably remember that back in 2016, that was when lockdown drills in schools started being almost universal. And who would have thought that we would have to prepare our children for a drill in case an active shooter comes into the classroom? Climate change, we've known climate change is on the agenda for many, many years, but I really think it's only been the last 5 to 10 years that people have begun to think of it as really such a sort of existential crisis for humanity. And I could go on. We're living in the era of social media, of everything, of technology pushing into our homes, into our lives 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And the average American child, I think it's younger now, 2 years ago when I wrote the chapter, was receiving a cell phone at the age of 10 years old. So by 10, it's almost impossible to stop the world coming in to our children's lives in a way that we never would have thought of a generation ago. So we really felt, and that sort of doesn't even address the divided democracy issues, the sort of the social justice issues, the fact that we're living in this era where there's such huge gaps between haves and have-nots. So many things that was pre-pandemic, racial justice and all these things, and here we are in 2020. So confession, I made a mistake in the book, because at the end of the book, in the epilogue, I write how I decided to write the book after 2016. And in 2017, beginning of 2017, Twitter had a competition, describe 2016 in 3 words. And one Twitter user wrote worst period year period ever. And I actually wrote that in the book. I regret that. But yeah, that's why.
Your fault. Yeah.
Who would have thought? Now none of us can wait for 2020 to end.
It's true. That's true. Yeah, it's just amazing to think, right? Like how in 2016 we were talking about civil discourse being done, and here we are, all the more so. And we hope that it doesn't continue in that general direction. I went like that, but maybe more like that. And yet we know that different things are going to come up all the time, and where we have to have these conversations. And you sort of addressed on it a little bit, but in the, I think it's introduction or the first chapter, you mentioned that, and it just sort of shocked me, but then I had to think about it for a little bit, that statistics show that the world is safer now for children than 30 or 40 years ago, but we don't feel it. Can you talk a little bit about that, and like, why are we safer? Why don't we feel it? How do we help our children feel safer, or should we, right? Like, is it actually better that they're sort of on their toes? I don't know.
Yeah. Look, I mean, the world is safe. I took the indices of crime and violence, because I think when people feel sort of, is our place is safer, they want to look at crime statistics. And so if you look at the crime statistics, we have been, our society has, we have significant decreases in crime over more than the last 30 years. So since the 90s, the crime has been going down consistently. In that sense, the world is a safer place. So why is it that we're not feeling that? On the contrary, why is it that, and I did the research not just in the US, but the book's been published in England with an English publisher, and the data look the same in England. Why is it that over the last 10 years, we've seen increases in anxiety and depression and suicidality among kids of all ages, and obviously including teens? And we don't really have a good answer for it. Some people say, well, we're becoming more aware of it. So, you see increases in ADHD when people diagnose it more. But actually, and you see increases in child abuse when you have more, encourage people to come out and talk about it more. But actually, I don't think that the last 10 years have really shown us, I don't think we've had more access to healthcare providers to diagnose anxiety and depression over the last 10 years. I think simply, and people have talked about this, it's the access, relentless access to technology, and particularly social media, that that brings the world in, such that when a terrible thing happens, it could be 6,000 miles away, but it could feel like it's happening, in your front yard. And that's really a big issue, because it used to be a generation ago that you might watch the news, but otherwise you wouldn't really hear about things that were going on if they were sort of far away from your community. You might hear them vaguely, but by the time they got to you, they were watered down, and here, right now. And in fact, in the book, I have a conversation about a little boy who, he doesn't have a cell phone. His parents haven't bought him one, but his friend has one, and he doesn't give it in at the beginning of the school day. And so during the day, he sees an Amber Alert zip across the phone. what does a 9-year-old know from an Amber Alert? And then he sees a severe weather warning, and then this, and then that. And he comes home and he's freaked out. And I think that's what's happening. That I also think that, I mean, we know that social media has really changed the way interactions happen, and I don't necessarily think for the better. Right? There is certainly, you can certainly get support from social media, but there's a no holds barred approach to how people interact on social media. And I think when parents feel like the world is harsh and unforgiving and stressful, kids feel it too.
Of course. And you spoke a lot in the book actually about our own feelings as humans and adults and parents, and how they affect our conversations with our kids. And you use a great terminology, which is a red light conversation and a green light conversation. And I know that, you know, you should read the book to really understand it, but would love for you to share a little bit about those, because they felt so, that language just felt so poignant to me and so helpful in like, oh, maybe I need to redirect my own emotions now, you know?
Yeah, I mean, so everyone who's on, and by the way, thank you all for keeping, thank you for those of you who can keep your video on. It's so nice to be able to see who you're talking with. So thank you. Yeah, so I mean, think about the last thing that upset you, right? So, and think about where you were and how it made you feel. And so, let's take a random example. I went out to get the groceries, and I was in the store, and the person behind me wasn't wearing their mask properly, and they were sneezing, and that made me really agitated. And I grabbed my groceries, and I was just irritated and worried, and I got into the car, and the worry and the irritation stayed with me, because that's what happens. That we tend to get stuck, and I ruminated, like, could I catch coronavirus from a sneeze? Or we were there for a while because we weren't spaced apart and things like that. And then I get home, and my child says to me, mommy, why aren't we having dinner yet? Or something like that, whatever it is. And the emotion in me might spill over, and I could easily just go because it happens to all of us. The emotions get stuck in our heads, and then they spill over to our kids. And that's maybe a small everyday example. I really do think that's a small everyday example. But what if our child had come to us and really wanted something more fundamental? Like, she really was planning to say, Mommy, I had a bad day in school online, and I failed my test. And she didn't get to say it because I went rah, 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 and now I have to kind of rewind. And so in the book, as Rabbi Feller mentioned, I start with ourselves, because our kids see the world through the bubble of their family, and we are our kids' best teachers. And when things bother us and we allow that to spill over, then not only do our kids notice that, but sometimes it can affect the way we respond to our children. So in the book, I sort of talk about it as put your own mask on before assisting others. And so in that example where I was irritated and worried at the grocery store, what might I do instead of just sort of barging into the house and, I might sit in the car for an extra couple of minutes, take a few deep breaths, remind myself where I am, check the facts that it's very unlikely that I'm going to get coronavirus from a 15-second interaction with someone, decide I'm going to wash my hands as soon as I get into the house, and I'm going to go in and I'm going to be set up for what you mentioned would be a green light conversation, so that when my child comes up to me, instead of saying, or just wait till I put the groceries down and hold on, and I couldn't get dinner on the table earlier because I had to do this and blah, blah, I might instead turn and say, hey, you look worried. I can see on your face that your eyes are downward cast and your brow is furrowed. And I wonder if you feeling worried about something. But I wouldn't be able to notice that had I not been able to put my own mask on first.
Yeah, I just think I just found that so helpful. And I think even, with kids, absolutely, but also in this world, hard world of all of us being together 24/7 with, I think with partners too, where like they are sort of the first people to get the wow, wow, wow. And I think I've noticed that I've been using that language a lot. So thank you. Thank you. Um, so yeah, I said earlier that a lot of those types of conversations, especially the green light conversations, seem to happen in your book around food, which as I actually, there's one of my great professors actually did work on this about how so much religion happens around the dinner table, because it seems like a sacred place. And I'm just wondering, like, when are the good times to have these big conversations about things like, the bully at school, or the lockdown drill at school, or the hurricane that's coming, right? Like what is a good context, a good setup, for such a conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I love, oh, when you were talking about food, I was thinking about our Friday night dinners.
Mhm.
My husband's the chef, he makes the challah, and there's a big debate every Friday night about how doughy the challah is going to be, because my daughter likes it doughy and I don't like it doughy. We have one left at home, actually. One is temporarily back from college, yeah. And there's this big debate, like, what's the challah going to look like inside? But I think you're right. The big conversations, and that's really the beauty. And one of my colleagues actually has done a lot of research, years of research on family meal times. They are beautiful opportunities to be able to have conversations, hard, easy, general, what's going on, sharing stuff. Um, so I think that those are wonderful. But I also use food in the book as a way, in a way, and I had to think about this carefully because I'm a psychologist, and we don't want to use food, like to deal with difficult feelings. But um, the classic example of, and I don't know, this isn't happening so much now because our kids aren't in school, but of the child who comes off the school bus, right? Comes into the house and is sad or upset about something. And I know that for me, when I was a young child growing up in London, in England, there was a ritual to coming home from school, and we would have a snack, and we would sit down and have a glass of milk and a cookie. And I think what that represents is a sort of buffer between the outside world and the inside world.
Mhm.
And so, and a lot of stuff happens at school, and so that's just one example. But when your child comes in, and even if it's now, the example I often give is, your child, your 9-year-old is playing with the neighbors, they're in your bubble, or they're careful, they wear masks, and she runs inside, and it could be just before dinner, and she says, "Mommy, you won't believe it. Ruthie's grandma is really sick and she's in the hospital." And your heart sinks because you had managed to keep COVID at bay. Everyone in your bubble was okay. And, you might know people peripherally who were badly affected, but it's never been this close. And your child, that your child is going to have questions. And if you don't take a breath or take a little time to think, what you might do is turn around in your loving mom or dad way, cuddle your child and say, "Oh, honey, it's going to be okay. Her grandma's a really tough lady. I know her. She's going to be just fine." In that situation, it's not so clearly an example of rah rah, our emotions spilling over, but it's a more subtle one. We want more than anything else to tell our children it's all going to be okay. And we can't, certainly not now. And we never want to be in a position where we have to confess to our child that we actually lied to them, and God forbid something happens. So in that situation, you're sort of, your breath is taken away from you. You sort of have that feeling in your stomach, and you might say, "Oh, honey, I can see from your face that you're looking really worried," and you might reflect the features on her face. how are you feeling? And she might say, I'm really worried, mummy. I want, what's going to happen to her? And I heard that a lot of people who go to hospital, they get really sick and they die. And what's going to happen? It's Ruthie's grandma. And so what you're doing is you're acknowledging the way she's feeling. That's really important because she has big feelings. Emotions are very powerful signals. We can talk a little bit about how emotions are so powerful and what happens if we don't respond appropriately to emotions. And then what you might say to her is, you're worried. You told me you're worried. You know what? If it was me and my best friend's grandma was really sick, I would also be really worried. And I never had to go through coronavirus when I was a little girl, but I did. I do remember that my friend at school one day, she told me her grandma was really sick and I was so worried for her, etc. So you've validated your child's emotions. You've said, I'm taking the time to notice how you're feeling, what your facial expression shows, and your feelings are valid, right? They're important. But what you've also done in that time is you've bought yourself a little bit of time to think about when she does ask you the questions, what are you going to say and how are you going to say it? And so the other thing that I would say, especially if you have a child who's really sad, is crying, is sobbing, is come in, honey, let me go get you a glass of water and a cookie. Let's sit down, because, okay, that's that buffer between the outside and the inside. And by the way, when you turn your back to fill up the glass with water, you have a chance to sort of, take a breath yourself. And that I think is really important. We buy ourselves a little bit of time, even 30 seconds, to think about what's she going to want to know? How am I going to reassure her without lying to her, without telling her too much? How am I going to deal with this? Is this a conversation I'm willing to have now, or should I wait for my partner to come home, or those kinds of questions?
Yeah. What you're talking about are in Judaism, we or in prayer, we call them like liminal spaces, right? Our tradition is like obsessed with them. We have all of these prayers, making sure that we're okay between one place and the other, or one time of day and the other, because the transition times are nerve-wracking for people, but they're nerve-wracking and also transformative, which I think is what you're talking about, right? Like these moments that we have with the people we love the most, to actually transform and show what our values are and what our conversations are. I'm wondering, because I see who's on the call, and I know that we have some parents of teenagers on the call. What would that conversation look like with an older kid? Someone who, I'm imagining myself as a teenager being like, Mom, if you tell me I look sad, I'll, like, go away.
Yeah.
Right. So what does that look like in that regard?
Yeah, and in fact, that was exactly the question that was asked of me by a wonderful colleague who I've acknowledged in the book, who's the rabbi of our local conservative shul. And he said, I actually gave him a couple of the examples. I have a couple of conversations about anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism. He said, these are all good, but what if you have a kid who doesn't talk? And I think that's really an important question, because it's not only that the child, stop asking me, but I think it can be quite hard for kids who are more private, whether or not they're a teenager, that's even more so if they're a teenager, that they can feel, if you say, how are you feeling, that they can feel really intruded on. And the last thing we want is to have our child feel that we're being intrusive. So when you have a teen in particular who, like with younger children, sometimes very young children, you're not sure if they know the names for the emotions, right? And that's why you say, are you feeling sad? Because they learn that sad equals my face looking this way and a feeling in my body. But with a teen, you can assume they know. And I think it's then fine to sort of leave it alone and have the conversation at a time where the young person doesn't feel on the spot, or you can have a conversation with your partner. And so one of my favorite ways of having these conversations at the dinner table with a sullen teenager is you and your spouse. I had a really hard day at work today. What happened? Well, there was this this guy, we were just talking, we were in a staff meeting. I hate though, I really don't like being in conference rooms. We were all wearing a mask, and someone said, I got to have my lunch, took her mask off to eat her lunch. And then someone else was talking about his cousin who was really, really sick with COVID, and and it was really painful. And I was angry and I was upset, and I just had this feeling in my stomach. And and that could be a wonderful essential conversation to have when you, let's say, have a teenager who's dealing with the same, maybe parallel issues, but he doesn't want to talk about them with you. And so he's not forced to enter the conversation, but he's a witness to it. And in my experience, having been through 4 teenagers, 2 of them are still, actually all 4 of them, according to the American Medical Association, are because you're technically a adolescent until you're 28, just saying. So all 4 of them are technically still teenagers. They will join in if they're not put on the spot, if it doesn't look like you're, and by the way, like walking the dog or being in the car where you don't have to look at each other, those are great times to have conversations. Yeah. So you don't have to sort of they don't have to feel like you're staring into their eyes.
Right. Well, when they're not being put on the spot, and when you're demonstrating how to have the conversation, right? When you're demonstrating that, like, you too get upset and get annoyed and all those things. I think that's so important. I have a ton more questions, but I want to make sure that the people on our call have a chance to ask some questions as well. So does anyone have any questions at the moment?
We're good. I have like a thought that's been moving through my head as you've gone through this. So we talk a lot, right? Like Rabbi Fischel mentioned, right? We talk about the spaces in between. We also talk a lot about these kids with these questions of ultimacy. And sometimes it's not as tangible as the moment in COVID that's so universal right now. Sometimes it's very, very, very particular. And I haven't had a chance to read your whole book yet. I've just begun it, and I'm loving it, as an aside. And so everyone should buy it because it is fantastic. And your voice is so clear and so open in the way that you write, so approachable. I think that sometimes when we are talking with children, we as adults project onto them this idea of what they might be thinking, or what we fear that they're thinking, or what we think they should be thinking. And I wonder if you could speak a bit to the idea of like what are the best ways to tease out actually like what they are doing before we jump in, right? Like in that moment of taking a breath, do you have, thoughts and experiences on that?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked it, because we didn't get far down the conversation route. We got to the emotions. Your child comes in, and let's take a teenager, since we were on the teen in the teen space. But let's say your 14-year-old comes home. Let's take a non-COVID example, and you're at work, you're on Zoom, and your 14-year-old comes home and slams the door, and she knows that's exactly what you've asked her not to do because you're in a meeting. Okay, the door slams, and you stop yourself from doing the red light thing, which would be to storm out at the end of the meeting and say, what on earth do you think? You take your breath, you go in, and you realize that she's not usually a door slammer, that there must be something up. And you sort of say, hey, haven't seen you all day, or haven't seen you for a while. Sounds like things might not be all right. You take the opportunity to validate her emotions. She says, well, I just found out that someone posted these photos of me on social media. And you sort of take your own breath again, and because you're sort of horrified. I think most of us jump to this, photos of my kid on social media that she doesn't want. And you just validate her worry, and then you sit down and say, just tell me all about it. Because what Stephanie just said, that point is the point at which I would jump in with that one sentence. Someone posted photos of me on social media, and I would think that I know what's happened. Social, and so my immediate reaction might be, how could you allow someone to post social photos of me on social media. In the similar conversation I have in the book, it's she broke up with her boyfriend, and her boyfriend posted photos that are compromising on social media. And so and the immediate reaction might be to either blame the child, how could you allow that, or blame I told you that boyfriend was no good. But instead you say, just let's take a seat, let's sit down, let's have a cookie, let's just sit down, and I want to hear about it. And you just let her talk, and you do what parents really don't like doing, which is you don't say anything, you just listen. And I think even after 2 or 3 sentences, we think we can finish our kids' sentences for them, we think we know what's going to happen, but when we truly let them talk, sometimes we can be really surprised at the things that they will tell us if we let them. And if we don't either jump in with advice or judgment or reactions that show the way we're feeling and that may inhibit them. So I think letting them talk is so, so, so important. To go back to the pandemic, because I think we are living in such a difficult time. It's a really difficult time for parents, but for teenagers, it's really hard, So, your teen comes in and let's say it's not about photos on social media. Let's say she says, there was that school thing. This is actually a real example from my daughter. Well, there was supposed to be an event organized by school, and it was supposed to be socially distanced, and no one was wearing masks, and everyone was hugging each other. And I don't know what to do, because I don't want to get the Ronies, but all these kids, but I also don't want to be left out. Like, I don't want to miss parties because I don't want them to think that I'm scared of the Ronies, but I also know grandma, we see grandma. And I think that's a very difficult dilemma for teens. There's so much social pressure and to know, and of course it's hard for parents as well. So, you have to set limits, and you might have to stop your kid going to parties, but it's much better if she decides not to go to parties herself. So it's a very, very, very tricky balance. And the other thing that I think is so hard, and sometimes if you listen enough, you might get to this, is that, like everybody else, teens are worried about mortality, right? My daughter had a friend who ended up in the emergency room in critical care, 21 years old, with the virus. And there's no one, no one's automatically spared. And mortality is a really hard thing for teenagers to think about. And in general, like, all our worst nightmares are that our loved ones get taken from us, our children, that their parents die, parents, that something happens to their children. I mean, it's a really, really, really difficult time. So I think more than ever, so ironically, I think it's harder for us to sit and listen because we have so much coming at us. But I think now more than ever, it's more important to really be able to sit and listen.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And while we're on the sort of teen genre or teen area, you talk about both anti-Semitism as well as like anti-Zionist movements on campus. And a lot, like, all of your conversations sort of happen in real time, right? So an event happens, and then you have to have this conversation with your kid. And I know that Washington Hebrew thinks a lot, and we've been thinking a lot about how do we prepare our kids for campus when they're going off to college. So how does an essential conversation look like about anti-Zionist movements on campus? Like, how does a pre-conversation look if something hasn't actually happened yet, but you're anticipating it to happen, if that makes sense?
Yeah. So adolescence is such a fascinating time in so many ways. And I think in some ways, like, when you're not getting angry with your adolescents because they're doing things that that you feel are just to annoy you, but in other ways, it's so beautiful to see them becoming their own person. And of course, you're in DC, you're in the capital. It's there's so much going on, so you've really been sort of at the forefront. our kids grow up and then they decide that they're going to go off to college somewhere, and hopefully they do all get the opportunity to go, whether it's closer to home or further from home, and they all make decisions about where it is they want to go. And unfortunately, I think for many Jewish kids, they have to be prepared for a campus that might not be as warm and friendly and comfortable as the homes and the communities that they grew up in. And I think that can be very startling for a lot of kids. And so the example, the conversation that I've included in the book is about a young woman and her mom who go visit a campus. And I actually, I had a couple of campuses in mind when I wrote the conversation. And one of the things I talk about at the very beginning of the book is for parents to think about their own sensitivities and what things are in their own backgrounds and experiences that might predispose them to be particularly sensitive to something or other, as well as what our values are, like what values we want our children to take from us. So in this situation, the young woman's with her mom, who is the daughter of a Holocaust survivor. And as they drive into the college gates, there is a demonstration against Israel that talks about the Nazi apartheid state or something like that. And the mother, of course, has an immediate reaction. This would be the red light, but she just says, I told you this isn't the place for you. They hate Jews. Don't, why are we even here? Immediately shutting off a conversation with the daughter, who just says, oh, mom, you have no idea what's going on. You're so out of touch. Come on. And then, obviously there's a rewinding and a green light, but the daughter, she has an experience, she goes off and she sits in a class and she goes into a dorm and she has another experience of, she's called a bougie, and she realizes, wow, this is really different to how I grew up. And in the red light conversation, she might be scared to talk to her mom because of her mom's such extreme reaction. In the green light conversation, she feels able to say, yeah, this weird thing happened, right? And they said something and about Israel and Jews, and and the Jews are responsible for all this stuff that happened in 9/11, and what were they talking about, And the mom gets a chance to debrief that and to sort of check the facts, which is the big thing that I talk about in the book, like check the facts and figure out and learn about what are the anti-Semitic tropes that are happening. It's again, it's driven by the mom's values, the parents' values. And so we have to always decide, like, I'll say, I never tell people what to say, but how to say it, right? So how you feel, and there's so many different sort of ranges of opinions about Israel, about, and, less about anti-Semitism, but Israel, and sort of different views and opinions. And the main thing is that everyone should sort of have an idea of what it is they want to discuss with their child, and then how to do that in a way that doesn't shut down the conversation.
A lot more questions and listening than answers, or statements of belief, which can be so hard, especially, easy. I think almost easier when it's not political. And then when we're so used to, again, as our civil discourse has sort of faltered, I think all of us are now really practiced in saying, this is what I believe and what I stand for. And if you don't, then that's a bad thing. And God forbid that would ever come out towards our children. Right. Which would be a horrible influence, I think. But also we're not practiced to take a step back in such a situation, which I think is really difficult. Absolutely. I have many more questions. Does anyone else have any questions that they would like to pose?
I had a questions about the early years, since that's more my focus. I'm not there yet. How do you establish the foundations for trust so your children can be able to have those conversations with you? I believe it starts at a young age, but how do you do that?
It's a great question. It's a big question when you talk about trust, but I'll take it in a little bit of a narrower way, which is the trust that I can talk with my parents and that they will be able to listen to me without being upset, right? So we know that kids learn about emotions in three ways. And so one way they learn about emotions is they watch us parents deal with our own big emotions. So when we get upset or sad or overwhelmed, our kids are watching us and they observe how we behave and they learn from that. Another way that they learn about emotions is by the way we respond to their big emotions. So when your child comes in, and this is sort of an old school, I'm sure it doesn't happen certainly present, not in the present company, but the 8-year-old boy or 5-year-old boy who comes in from the school bus crying and his dad says, "What's going on?" And he says, "Someone took my backpack and threw it on the ground." And the dad says, "Big boys don't cry. Stop your crying. Come on, wipe those tears away." That teaches the child something about the emotion of sadness or fear, which is it is unacceptable. It's what we might call sort of a punishing response. Another kind of response to that same child might be, "Oh, honey, oh, let me wipe those tears away. Come in, let's watch TV and have a snack and forget about it," right? Which is another kind of response, and it's in a different way, and no judgment on what we all sort of that there's so many things that determine what we do in the moment, but we all mean well when we do these things. But that response in a pleasant way also suggests to the child, stop crying, that's not useful, let me make you happier. Like, you don't need to. It's what we would call a dismissive response. Another response might be the child comes in crying and the parent says, "Wow, I can see, looks to me like you're sad," or "How are you feeling? Because I can see you're crying." "I'm sad." "Okay. Oh, what, I get like your tears are falling down your face and you're sort of hunched over. I wonder if you're feeling anything else as well." "I'm scared." "Oh, what happened?" "This boy, he grabbed my backpack and he threw it on the ground." "No wonder you feel scared. I think I would feel sad and scared if someone did that to me too." And that's the validation of the emotions. So in that example, what mom has said is basically what she's conveyed is, I see your emotion. That's a very powerful message that you're sending. I see that you have a big emotion. You've told me that you're feeling sad and scared, and no wonder, that is valid. So what people like John Gottman and Nancy Eisenberg, psychologists out west, have done over many years is research on on what we call emotion socialization. And what we know is that children whose parents tend to dismiss or invalidate or even punish their emotions are children who are more at risk for anxiety and depression. And conversely, kids whose parents take the time to coach their emotions, which is what we're doing in these essential conversations, are children who are more protected from anxiety and depression, because they learn to respect what their emotions mean. They learn to pay attention to them as signals. And then they learn that instead of like shoving them away, they can pay attention to them as signals and choose how to respond to them. Often what happens, and I've spent many years dealing, working with people who suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder and things like that, is when these things sort of intrude and take over, we don't feel like we have the choice about how to respond. But when we notice them, when we pay attention to the emotions and we register, "Oh, I'm feeling really sad. I have that feeling in my stomach. Oh, and I realize why I'm feeling sad," then we can make a choice about how we respond to that. So that's a very, so in terms of your question about trust, teaching kids about emotions, I think and we never well, first, we never learn to parent anyway, but we don't really learn about how to teach our kids about emotions, but you can do that from very young. And I think when you do that, and when you teach them how important emotions are, kids will learn not only to be able to share those emotions with you, but they'll learn better to be able to regulate them, which is a very important task of childhood. And in that sense, I think the trust will develop because relationships become more transparent.
Thank you. You give so many good examples in the book of what these essential conversations could be about, or what could spark them. And I'm just thinking about the moment we're in right now, and we are in pandemic, and you talk about that too, and we've talked about it a lot tonight. I'm also thinking about our own anxieties as well as our kids' anxieties about getting out of pandemic, and anticipating that a little bit. And you sort of already set up this paradigm for these conversations, but what might a conversation look like, or what tools could we have to have those conversations? Because I think God willing we'll have them soon. But I think there's not only will we physically have to be healthy to go back into the world, but I think there's going to be a lot of social barriers there too.
Totally. And there are so many conversations that we need to have. And so what I didn't get to yet was that how does the essential conversation resolve itself? Because it starts with your child bringing something, or you needing to talk to your child about something, focusing on the emotions, validating the emotions, listening to your child. But to me, sort of part of the meat of the conversation is going through a problem solving process with your child, so that they can come out of the conversation feeling that they have tools to do something about it. So let's say, let's talk about the happy time when our kids can go back to school, right? And I don't know if any of you have, I don't know if people in the community have kids in school, or is it mostly still, they do? No, half.
It's somewhat. Some kids are going into school, and some are still virtual.
Yeah. So we're completely virtual, but I think what happens is when kids go back to school full time, there are going to be a lot of really anxious kids. So one of the things we've learned, inadvertently or not, from the pandemic is that the only really safe place is home. And for a kid who is already a little anxious, or maybe a slow to warm up child who finds loud noises, a little bit overwhelming, and new things kind of scary, that can be a very scary prospect. So let's say you're having the conversation is about the worries related to going back to school. And so you go through the emotions, you listen to your child's worries about going back to school, and then you say, look, we are going to together, we're going to find ways to help you feel less anxious and safer about going back to school, and be able to be integrated into school better. Now, those two things, they're sort of slightly different. One is you're helping your child have tools to regulate his emotions, to help himself feel less anxious and less scared about going back to school. And the second thing is, maybe something concrete that you can do in relation to, let's say, connecting with friends or with the teacher, or navigating building, things like that. And so what we want to do often with our kids is we want to say, let me tell you how I've got some ideas for you. This is what we're going to do, right? Because we want to help our kids feel better, but we don't do them any favors when we solve the problems for them. So what we're going to do is we're going to brainstorm. I'm going to have an idea, and then you're going to have an idea, right? And so you might say, like, I know that you love your stress ball. And so we're going to get you a special stress ball to go back to school. And your child might say, well, my idea is that I can homeschool. I don't need to go back to school, right? And so you're going to write that down, because all ideas are good ideas. And then you're going to say something like, well, on the thing about school, I think maybe we could drive to the school and see it. so that you get used to seeing it again. Maybe we can even go inside and your child says, well, and I haven't seen my friends for ages. Can we have some friends over? It's post-pandemic, of course. So, so you write everything down, and then at the end, that's when you say, look, I know you want to homeschool, but I think you know what I'm going to say to that, right? Because that's a rule that we have, that we go to school. But here are some things that we can do. And you generate them. And the result is that your child has tools and strategies for action that he has co-created, that not just what you have told him that he needs to do. I actually have a lovely example on a different topic that if we have a couple of minutes at the end, I can tell you it's a racial justice example, but
feel free. Absolutely.
Yeah. So the summer, we live in Minneapolis, which is where George Floyd was murdered. And it was a really hard June. I live about not even 2 miles from where he was murdered. And for days, there were helicopters circling around. And we heard about riots and protests, and the shops were closed up, or there was looting, and it was really a difficult few weeks, for no one more than the people who lived right there, who already were living in sort of a food desert, and then had all their stores either looted and burned or boarded up. And against that backdrop, we live in this little cul-de-sac, and we have a lot of young families, and they spent their summer with, masks on, biking around the cul-de-sac. And my next door neighbor has this beautiful 6-year-old girl. She was biking around that week, the same week that George Floyd was murdered, and she fell off her bike and broke her leg. So in the middle of the pandemic, it's 90 degrees outside. Her parents take her to the hospital. She gets a big old cast, and she's sitting in her front yard watching all the other kids biking around. And so she gets talking with her parents about what's happened. And they have this really wonderful, essential conversation with her about what happened, they tailor it to her, what a 6-year-old can understand, and what does this mean, and why was this man, why did this happen to this man, and what does that mean about the police? And they get to talking about why the helicopters are circling, and lots of people are very angry, and the shops had to close, and because the shops had to close now, some people are going to find it hard to get food. So their problem solving is around not just helping her feel better, but what can she do? What can she do about it? And between them, they come up with this most unbelievable solution. So she says to her parents, well, I want to buy food for the people who don't have food. And so she says, so she gets her parents to carry her around their backyard. She picks all these flowers. She ties them into little bouquets. They pull her in a radio flyer cart down the street, knock on everyone's door, stand back, and then trade a bouquet of flowers for a donation. If I tell you that this kid and her friend, between them, made $800, including, and then their grandmas did a matching thing. It was unbelievable. The parents loaded her into the back of the car, took her to the supermarket, sat her in the cart. They bought piles and piles of food and drove that food to the food bank, right, downtown. And how that kid was able to feel, from feeling completely helpless, literally not even being able to walk with a broken leg, from feeling that she could do something. So that's my beautiful example of a essential conversation.
It's really beautiful, and also feels it feels really Jewish to me, of course. I'm gonna bring it there, right? But that these essential conversations that start with our own values as parents and as a family, can not only create a safer and healthier environment for our kids, but also radiate and ripple effect out into the world, and to help make this world a better place. What could be more Jewish than starting with a family unit, and seeing how that can radiate light to the rest of the world. That's so So God, I love that story.
Well, I think the thing is, we're all feeling so helpless and disempowered, and like there's chaos outside. And it's easy to get sucked in and stuck in that. And but I believe there's always something small that everyone can do. And just in enabling sort of empowering our kids to recognize that there is something they can do helps them hugely to feel less disempowered and less helpless and more engaged. And I think those are the kids that will feel less hesitant about going back into the world, because they feel that there are things that they can do. It's tikkun olam. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Definitely. And I love the idea of acting as part of these emotional conversations, right? That, and of course, like you have to, right? If you're just going to sit with it and talk with it, that's great. But the action part is where it's at, and empowering our youth is the only way we're really going to get out of all of this, right? And make sure that we are giving our kids the tools that they need to succeed and to help our world to succeed, which is exactly what you're doing. So thank you so much for giving us these tools this evening, and for bringing this book into the world so that we're able to use it and see it and read it. And I, hope that we all have really good essential conversations with our kids, that we use these next few months really well, right? Because it's bad, and I wish that we could be out of our homes, but also thank God we get so much time with our families. And now is the time, I think, to practice exactly what you preach, right? Now is the time, a lot of time around dinner tables, to practice what these conversations look like. So really, really thank you. It's just such a pleasure to chat with you and to hear about this a little bit.
Well,
Thank you all for joining us. Sorry, yes.
Amen.
Thank you all for joining
Yeah.
us, and we really hope you have a wonderful Hanukkah. For those who don't know, we're going to be lighting the Hanukkah every night at 6:45 over Zoom, of course. So we would love for you to join us there, and we have some other Hanukkah events and videos and lots of ways to engage. So thank you so much for joining. Thank you again to the Jewish Book Council for allowing us to be able to have this conversation. And yes, please, if you would like to buy this book, the link is in the chat box. I highly recommend it. It's just so helpful. And Dr. Gewirtz, thank you.
Well, and I would say thank you so much. It's been complete and utter treat. If you read the book, please post a review on Amazon. That would be really helpful. And a really happy Hanukkah, everyone, and have a safe, wishing you health and safety, and us all to be able to get out of to enjoy being in our homes, but also to be able to get out of them.
Absolutely. And you too. Wonderful. Bye, everybody.